Route 395 stretches through desolate landscapes where the highway cuts through miles of dark desert and towering mountains. It's a road that feels infinite, surrounded by silence so profound that even the faintest sound seems deafening. For officers patrolling that stretch, the isolation itself can feel eerie, but sometimes it's the things that break the silence that stay with you. It was a cold winter evening when the call came in. A truck driver had reported a stranded vehicle on a remote section of the highway. The dispatcher relayed that it was a woman who'd called in, claiming her truck had broken down, and she sounded panicked. The officer assigned to the call, Deputy Paul Hargrove, had been patrolling the area for years and knew how dangerous it could be. As Hargrove drove toward the scene, the stretch of highway grew darker, with only the faint glow of his patrol car's headlights illuminating the road. The stars above felt closer than usual, their cold light reflecting off the desert floor. But as he approached the mile marker provided in the report, there was no truck in sight. Instead, there was something far more unsettling, a single shoe. Hargrove slowed his patrol car, its headlights landing on a white sneaker lying haphazardly on the shoulder of the road. He stopped and stepped out, the bitter cold biting through his uniform. The desert air was unnaturally quiet, the only sound coming from the crunch of gravel beneath his boots. The shoe was small, likely belonging to a woman, and appeared clean, as if it had been placed there recently. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold ran down Hargrove's spine. He looked around, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, but the desert seemed empty. Then he saw it. Further down the shoulder, the faint outline of a truck emerged in the shadows. The truck was old, its once vibrant blue paint now dulled by years of sun exposure and dust. Its hood was popped open, and its front end was dented, as if it had struck something. But what struck Hargrove most was the driver's door. It was wide open. He approached cautiously, his flashlight scanning the ground. Around the truck, he noticed several sets of footprints in the dirt, a woman's, alongside larger prints that didn't match her shoes. They led away from the vehicle and into the desert, disappearing into the darkness beyond the reach of his light. Hargrove called out, "Sheriff's Department. Is anyone there?" His voice echoed, but there was no response. He moved closer to the truck, peering inside. The interior was messy but intact. An open bag of snacks, a cell phone left on the passenger seat, and a half-empty water bottle in the cup holder. The phone screen was cracked, and it appeared to have been dropped or smashed. The panic in the woman's voice during the earlier call now made sense. She had been in trouble, and she was gone. Backup arrived within 30 minutes, but it felt like hours to Hargrove. The longer he waited, the more the silence around him pressed in, his unease growing. When the other officers arrived, they began searching the area. The footprints leading into the desert were their first clue, but the tracks quickly became erratic, scattered, as if there had been a struggle. As the search widened, they found more unsettling evidence. A scarf snagged on a low bush, a torn piece of fabric that matched the woman's description from the dispatcher, and then a second shoe lying in the dirt nearly a mile from the truck. It was as if she had been dragged or chased. The officers continued searching late into the night, their flashlights casting long, thin beams across the barren landscape. They called out her name repeatedly, their voices swallowed by the vast emptiness. But there was no sign of the woman herself. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation stalled. The woman's identity was eventually confirmed through her vehicle's registration. Her name was Erin Clark, a 27-year-old traveling to visit family in Nevada. Her family had reported her missing when she failed to arrive, and the discovery of her abandoned truck deepened their fears. The case grew colder with each passing day. There were no leads, no witnesses, and no evidence of where Erin could have gone. Search parties combed the area for weeks, but the desert gave up no answers. Then, nearly a month later, everything changed. It was late evening when a farmer, tending to his land miles away from Route 395, saw a disoriented figure stumbling toward his property. As she drew closer, he realized it was a woman. Her clothes torn, her face sunburned, and her eyes wide with terror. It was Erin Clark. When authorities arrived, Erin was incoherent, muttering fragments of sentences about a man who had taken her. Medical examiners confirmed she was dehydrated, malnourished, and covered in bruises and cuts. But what shocked them most were the rope burns around her wrists and ankles. Once she regained enough strength to speak, Erin told her story. She had been driving along Route 395 when her truck broke down. While waiting for assistance, a man had pulled over, offering help. At first, he seemed kind, but as the conversation continued, Erin grew uneasy. When she refused his offer for a ride, the man became aggressive. He forced her out of her vehicle, dragged her into the desert, and tied her up. For weeks, she had been held captive in an abandoned shack deep in the wilderness. The man rarely spoke, his behavior erratic and terrifying. Erin's only solace was the fact that he occasionally left her tied up and unguarded, giving her the chance to plan her escape. The night she fled, she ran barefoot through the desert, the sharp rocks and cold air cutting into her skin. She had no idea how far she had gone before she saw the faint lights of the farmer's property. The man was eventually tracked down and arrested, identified as a drifter wanted for similar crimes in other states. Though Erin survived, the memory of her ordeal haunted her. She later thanked the officers who had searched for her and the farmer who saved her life. But she never drove through Route 395 again. To this day, officers patrolling that stretch of highway keep an eye out for abandoned vehicles. Because sometimes they're more than just breakdowns. They're warnings. The call came in at just after midnight. It was a 911 report from a neighbor. Loud screaming, shattering glass, and what sounded like a woman crying in one of the houses on the quiet suburban street. Dispatch logged it as a potential domestic disturbance and sent Officer Maria Castillo to check it out. Maria was experienced. Years on the force had taught her to approach domestic calls with caution. They were unpredictable, messy, and often far more dangerous than they seemed. She pulled up to the house in question, parked her patrol car quietly a few houses down, and approached on foot. The neighborhood was eerily still, save for the faint hum of crickets in the distance. The house in question stood in near darkness, with only a single dim light glowing in a front window. Maria's stomach twisted as she stepped onto the driveway. She could feel something was wrong. As she got closer, she could hear it. A low, muffled sound. Crying. Maria approached the door, her flashlight cutting through the shadows as she knocked firmly. "Police. Is everything all right in there?" The crying stopped. Dead silence followed. Maria's instinct screamed at her. This was not normal. She knocked again, harder this time. "Police. Open the door." Still no answer. But this time, she thought she heard something else. A faint rustling from inside, like someone moving quickly. Maria stepped back, radioed for backup, and waited. But as the seconds dragged on, the silence became unbearable. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone inside needed help, and fast. She tried the door. It was unlocked. The house was dark, the air heavy and stale. A faint metallic scent lingered, one Maria recognized all too well: blood. Her flashlight swept across the entryway, revealing overturned furniture and shattered glass on the floor. A picture frame lay face down near the door, its photo ripped in half. "Police," Maria called out, stepping cautiously inside. The crying started again, soft, broken sobs that seemed to come from deeper in the house. "Hello? I'm here to help," Maria said, her voice steady despite the growing tension in her chest. The sobbing grew louder as she moved down the hallway, her flashlight illuminating a trail of blood droplets leading toward a closed door. She reached the door, her heart pounding. "Ma'am, this is the police. I'm coming in." Maria pushed the door open, and what she saw made her stomach turn. A woman was tied to a chair in the center of the room, her face swollen and bruised, her wrists and ankles bound with duct tape. Blood dripped from shallow cuts across her arms, legs, and face. Hundreds of them, as if someone had methodically carved into her skin. Standing behind her was a man. He was holding a knife. The man turned to Maria, his face twisted in a disturbing mix of anger and satisfaction. "Stay out of this," he growled. "This is between me and her." Maria drew her weapon, keeping it trained on him. "Put the knife down. Now." The woman whimpered, her eyes wide with terror. The man didn't move. "I said drop the knife." Maria barked. For a moment, the man seemed to hesitate, his grip on the blade loosening. Then, without warning, he lunged toward the woman, the knife aimed at her throat. Maria didn't hesitate. She fired. The man crumpled to the floor, the knife clattering from his hand. Maria rushed forward, kicking the weapon away as she checked his pulse. He was alive, but unconscious. She turned her attention to the woman, who was shaking violently, tears streaming down her bloodied face. "You're safe now," Maria said softly, cutting through the duct tape with her utility knife. The woman collapsed into Maria's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Backup arrived minutes later, followed by paramedics who whisked the woman away for treatment. The man was restrained and loaded into an ambulance, his wounds non-lethal, but enough to ensure he couldn't harm anyone else. As the officers searched the house, they uncovered evidence that painted a chilling picture of what had transpired. The man was the woman's ex-boyfriend, a man with a history of violence and a restraining order against him. He had broken into her house earlier that evening, waiting for her to come home. When she arrived, he ambushed her, tying her up and tormenting her for hours. The cuts on her body weren't just random. They were deliberate, slow, and intended to cause maximum pain without killing her. The man had planned to continue torturing her until she either begged him to end it or succumb to the injuries. But the woman had managed to knock over a glass vase in the struggle, shattering it and alerting the neighbors to the commotion. In the days that followed, Maria visited the woman in the hospital. Her physical wounds were healing, but the emotional scars would take much longer to fade. "I thought I was going to die," the woman told Maria, her voice trembling. "I thought no one would come." Maria assured her she was safe now, that the man was in custody and would never hurt her again. But deep down, Maria knew the trauma of that night would linger, for both of them. The man was later convicted of multiple charges, including attempted murder, aggravated assault, and unlawful restraint. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But for Maria, the memory of that night remained vivid. The image of the woman bound and bloodied, the sound of her sobbing, the metallic smell of blood in the air. It all stayed with her. And every time she responded to a domestic disturbance call after that, Maria couldn't help but brace herself for the worst. Because she knew, better than most, how quickly a situation could spiral into something out of a nightmare. Some calls stay with you forever. Officer Sean Carter had always thought of himself as a rational man. After 6 years on the force, he had dealt with his share of strange situations, things that made you question reality if only for a moment. But there was always a logical explanation. Always. That was until the night he was dispatched to check out a break-in at an abandoned house on the edge of town. It was a quiet night, unusually so, with no backup immediately available. The call was a standard, suspicious activity report. A concerned neighbor had noticed a light flickering in the upstairs window of the old Greenfield house, a place no one had lived in for decades. The house was a relic from another time, its once grand facade now crumbling under years of neglect. Vines crawled up the sides, and the windows were dark and clouded, save for one upstairs where the flickering light had been seen. Sean arrived alone, his patrol car crunching over the gravel driveway. The house loomed in front of him, its silhouette stark against the faint glow of the moon. Something about it felt wrong. The front door was slightly ajar, its rusted hinges groaning as Sean pushed it open. The air inside was heavy, musty, and cold enough to make him shiver. His flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and debris scattered across the floor. "Police!" he called out, his voice echoing through the empty halls. "If anyone's in here, make yourself known." Silence. Sean moved cautiously through the first floor, his boots crunching over shattered glass and old wood. There were no signs of forced entry, but the eerie quiet was enough to set his nerves on edge. As he climbed the creaking staircase, the light from his flashlight caught something on the wall, an old, dusty mirror hanging crookedly. It reflected his silhouette as he moved past it, the beam of light bouncing off its cracked surface. At the top of the stairs, he found the source of the flickering light, an old oil lamp, its flames sputtering weakly. It was sitting in the middle of the hallway floor. Sean's grip tightened on his flashlight as he scanned the area. "Whoever's here, show yourself." The hallway stretched into darkness, lined with closed doors that seemed to stare back at him. The lamp flickered again, its flame dimming before roaring back to life, casting distorted shadows on the walls. And then, he heard it, a faint sound, like breathing, coming from behind one of the doors. Sean approached the door at the end of the hallway, his flashlight shaking slightly in his hand. The breathing grew louder as he got closer, deep, ragged, and uneven. "Police!" he barked. "Open the door." No response. He twisted the knob and pushed the door open, his flashlight cutting through the darkness inside. The room was empty. The breathing stopped the moment he stepped inside. Sean's flashlight revealed a bedroom frozen in time. Faded floral wallpaper, an old wooden bed frame, and a vanity with a large, ornate mirror. Dust hung thick in the air, disturbed only by his presence. But there was no one there. Sean turned back toward the hallway, his pulse pounding in his ears. As he stepped out of the room, something caught his eye, a shadow moving in the mirror on the wall. He spun around, his flashlight beam sweeping over the empty space behind him. Nothing. But when he looked back at the mirror, the shadow was still there. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, a faint outline of a figure standing just behind his reflection. Sean froze, his breath catching in his throat. He turned his head slowly, his eyes darting to the space behind him. Empty. He looked back at the mirror. The figure was closer now. Its shape was undefined, more like a smear of darkness than a person, but its presence was undeniable. Sean took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But something about the figure held him in place, like he couldn't look away. Then it moved. The figure's head tilted, mimicking his movements but slightly off, delayed, unnatural. Its face was a void, a black abyss that seemed to swallow the light from his flashlight. Sean's heart thundered in his chest as he raised his free hand toward the mirror, half expecting his reflection to match the motion. It didn't. The shadow figure raised its own hand, but at a completely different angle. It wasn't copying him. It was mocking him. Sean stumbled back, nearly dropping his flashlight. He turned and bolted down the stairs, his boots pounding against the creaking wood. The heavy silence of the house was replaced by the sound of his own frantic breathing. He reached the front door and threw it open, the cold night air hitting him like a wave. Sean didn't stop running until he was back in his patrol car. He slammed the door shut, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys. As the engine roared to life, he glanced back at the house, its dark windows staring back at him. In the upstairs window, the light flickered again, and for a split second, he saw it. The shadow figure, standing there, watching him. Sean reported the incident, but left out the details about the mirror and the shadow. Who would believe him, anyway? The house was searched the next day, but nothing was found. No intruders, no signs of anyone living there. The lamp in the hallway was gone, and the mirror was shattered, as if it had been smashed from the inside. Sean never returned to the Greenfield house, but every now and then, while driving past that stretch of road, he would catch a glimpse of the house in his rearview mirror. And sometimes, just for a moment, he thought he saw a shadow standing in one of the windows, watching, waiting. To this day, Sean avoids mirrors whenever he can, because now he knows. Sometimes, what you see in the reflection isn't you, and sometimes, it's waiting to get out. Officer Daniel Mercer had worked the night shift for years, patrolling the quiet streets of a small Midwestern town. He was used to the eerie stillness that settled over the town after dark, used to the way the streetlights cast long shadows and how the world seemed to shrink when the only sound was the hum of his patrol car's engine. But nothing had prepared him for what he saw behind the old shopping plaza. It was a slow night, the kind that made every minute stretch into an hour. Mercer had been idling near the empty strip mall, sipping lukewarm coffee, when dispatch crackled through his radio. Possible trespasser reported behind the old lot on 5th Street, the dispatcher said. Caller says they saw a man standing near the dumpsters. No further details. Mercer sighed. The shopping plaza had been abandoned for over a decade. Just an empty husk of boarded-up storefronts, a crumbling parking lot, and rusting metal dumpsters lined along the back. Kids sometimes snuck in to spray graffiti or dare each other to explore the hollowed-out buildings. But there was no real threat. He put his coffee down and shifted the car into drive. "Copy that," he said into his radio. He didn't expect to find much. He was wrong. The lot was deathly quiet when Mercer arrived. His headlights swept across the cracked pavement, illuminating weeds pushing through the concrete. The old buildings loomed in the darkness, their windows gaping like empty eye sockets. He pulled around to the back of the plaza and parked near the dumpsters. The area smelled of damp cardboard and rotting food, even though no businesses had been open here for years. And then he saw him. A figure stood just beyond the reach of his headlights, near the last dumpster in the row. Mercer grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the car. "Police!" he called out, his breath curling in the cold night air. "Let me see your hands." The figure didn't move. Mercer took a few steps closer, shining his light directly at the man. That's when the unease crept in. The man was too still, too perfectly still. His posture was rigid, his arms hanging stiffly at his sides. He was wearing a long, dark coat, and his head was tilted slightly downward. His face was obscured by shadows, but Mercer could feel his eyes, feel the weight of them watching him. A cold shiver crawled down Mercer's spine. Something about this wasn't right. "Sir, I need you to respond," Mercer called again. No reaction, not even a twitch. He moved closer, his grip tightening around the flashlight. Something in his gut told him to stop, to get back in the car and leave. But Mercer wasn't that kind of cop. He took another step, and the figure vanished. Mercer froze, his pulse hammering. 1 second, the man had been right there. The next, gone, like he had never been there at all. Mercer's flashlight beam swept over the spot where the figure had stood. There was nothing. No footprints, no movement, just the empty lot and the silent dumpsters. His breath came faster now, his heart thudding against his ribs. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the area. Nothing. But the feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. Mercer walked back to his patrol car, his fingers hovering over the radio. He hesitated. What was he supposed to say? That a man just disappeared in front of him? That a trespasser had somehow slipped away without a sound, without a single trace? His training told him to report it. But something deeper, something primal, told him not to. Instead, he sat in his car and kept the headlights on, watching the lot for another hour. But the figure never returned. Or, at least, he never let Mercer see him again. A week later, another call came in. Same lot, same description. A man standing near the dumpsters. This time, it was Officer Bennett who responded. And when Mercer asked him about it the next morning, Bennett wouldn't talk about it. Just shook his head and said, "I don't go near that lot anymore." Months passed. Officers stopped responding to calls from the old plaza. The reports never stopped, though. People still saw him. A man standing in the shadows. Motionless. Waiting. And if you got too close, he disappeared. But somehow, you knew he was still there. Watching. Mercer transferred to another district the following year. But sometimes, late at night, when he's driving alone, he sees something in his rearview mirror. A dark figure, standing too still on the side of the road. And Mercer doesn't stop anymore. Because now, he knows. Some things don't want to be found. Some things don't need to move. Because they're already waiting for you to come closer. Officer Jake Holloway had been on patrol long enough to know when something didn't feel right. It was always the quiet shifts that got to him. The long, uneventful nights where nothing seemed to happen. Until it did. That's what made him uneasy when dispatch assigned him to monitor a rural stop sign on the outskirts of town. It was a slow night, and a few complaints had come in about drivers rolling through without stopping. Routine stuff. He parked his cruiser near the intersection, cutting the engine so he could watch unnoticed. The stop sign stood alone under the dim glow of a single streetlight, casting a sharp, perfect shadow onto the pavement. The area was dead quiet. No wind, no animals, just an unnatural kind of stillness that made the night feel heavier. For the first half hour, nothing happened. A few cars passed through, stopping like they were supposed to. Holloway sipped his coffee, keeping an eye on the sign. Then, just for a second, he thought he saw something move. A shadow, right next to the stop sign. But when he focused, it was gone. Holloway frowned. Maybe it was just the headlights of a passing car, casting weird angles. But there was no traffic. Nothing that could have created that kind of movement. Still, he told himself it was nothing. For the next few minutes, he kept watching the intersection. Then it happened again. A dark shape, shifting against the pavement. It wasn't the shadow of the sign. It was something else. Something taller. Holloway sat up straighter, setting his coffee down. His hand hovered over the radio, debating whether to call it in. He wasn't sure what he would even say. "I'm seeing a shadow that's not supposed to be there?" It sounded ridiculous. Instead, he grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the cruiser. The moment his boot touched the pavement, the streetlight overhead flickered. A slow, deliberate pulse, on, off, on again. Holloway's stomach tightened. He walked toward the stop sign, shining his light across the road. Nothing. The stop sign stood still, its normal shadow stretching onto the pavement like always. No movement. No sign of anything unusual. And yet, he felt something. Like the air had gotten heavier. Like someone was watching him. Holloway turned, sweeping his flashlight along the side of the road. There were fields on both sides, tall grass shifting in the faintest breeze. Nothing that could explain the shadow he had seen. He took a step closer to the stop sign, and that's when he saw it. A second shadow, right next to his own. It wasn't his, and there was no one else there. Every instinct screamed at him to move. Holloway spun on his heel and bolted back to his cruiser, his pulse hammering. The streetlight flickered again, casting the entire road into darkness for half a second. And in that moment, he felt something behind him. Too close, almost breathing down his neck. The light came back on. Holloway threw himself into his car and slammed the door shut, locking it in one frantic motion. His breathing was ragged, his fingers gripping the wheel so tight they ached. For a long moment, he just sat there, staring at the stop sign, trying to convince himself he had imagined it. Then, his dashboard camera cut out. The screen went black. Static hissed over the speakers. Then, for the briefest second, it flickered back on, and there was something standing in front of the stop sign. A tall, shadowy figure, facing directly toward the camera. The screen glitched again. The figure shifted, closer now, its shape distorting as if the camera couldn't fully capture it. Holloway's chest tightened. Then, the screen cut to black again. The feed never came back. Holloway didn't stay to find out what it was. He turned the key, the engine roaring to life, and peeled away from the stop sign. In his rearview mirror, he saw the streetlight flicker one last time. And for the briefest moment, the shadow was still there, watching him leave. He didn't report it. What could he say? That a shadow moved on its own? That his dash cam caught something it wasn't supposed to? No one would believe him. But after that night, he avoided that intersection. And every now and then, officers still get complaints from drivers, saying that, late at night, when they stop at that sign, they feel like someone is standing just outside their car, waiting, watching, and if they look in their rearview mirror, they might see a shadow that doesn't belong to them. Officer Daniel Graves had seen some awful things in his 10 years on the force. Child neglect, overdoses, domestic violence. Cases that sat in the back of his mind long after he filed the reports. But nothing prepared him for the house on Sycamore Street. It started with a welfare check, just another routine call. The neighbor, an older woman who had lived in the area for years, had called 911. She said she hadn't seen the Jones family in over 4 days. The mother, Sarah Jones, was the type to keep things orderly, taking the trash out on time, tending to the flower bed, waving at neighbors. But now, the garbage was piling up. The blinds were shut. The mailbox was overflowing. The father, Mark, hadn't shown up to work. The kids, 2 little boys who usually played in the front yard, were nowhere to be seen. Something felt wrong. When Graves pulled up to the house, that feeling only grew stronger. The yard was overgrown, weeds pushing through cracks in the driveway. The front porch light flickered, its bulb nearly dead. The house itself felt abandoned. But the worst part? The smell. Even from outside, something foul clung to the air. A thick, sickly scent that Graves recognized immediately. He had smelled it before. The smell of decay. He knocked. Nothing. He knocked again. Harder this time. Silence. Graves frowned and tried the doorknob. Unlocked. He hesitated. Protocol dictated that he wait for backup, but his gut told him there was no time. He stepped inside. The second he crossed the threshold, the stench hit him full force. The heavy, putrid odor of something rotting. Graves covered his nose with his sleeve, breathing through his mouth as he scanned the room. It looked normal. Too normal. There were dishes stacked in the sink, kids' toys scattered on the floor, a half-eaten meal still sitting on the dining table, now covered in mold. It was as if life had just stopped in this house, like someone had pressed pause days ago. Something wasn't right, and then he heard it. A soft, trembling voice from upstairs. Graves' hand instinctively went to his holster as he moved up the stairs, his boots creaking against the old wooden planks. The voice was coming from the last bedroom on the right. He could hear it now, shallow breathing, uneven, like someone had been crying for a long time. His pulse quickened. He pushed the door open, and what he saw made his stomach drop. A little boy, maybe 6 years old, was sitting on the floor, his knees pulled to his chest. His face was thin, his skin pale and dirty. His lips were cracked, his hair matted, and his eyes hollow, like he had seen something no child should ever have to see. Graves crouched down, keeping his voice soft. "Hey, buddy. It's okay. I'm here to help." The boy didn't move, didn't even blink. His gaze flickered to the bed. Graves followed his eyes, and that's when he saw it. A tiny, lifeless hand, peeking out from under the mattress. Graves' heart slammed in his chest. He sprang to his feet, yanking back the mattress, and there, curled up in the darkness, was a second child. Another boy. His body was still, his skin gray, his eyes open but empty. Dead. The corpse had been stuffed under the mattress, hidden like a broken toy, and he had been there for days. Graves turned back to the surviving child, his stomach twisting. "Who did this?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. The boy stared at the floor. "They went to sleep," he whispered. Graves swallowed hard. "And your brother?" The boy's lips quivered. "He didn't wake up." Backup arrived within minutes, sirens breaking the silence. Paramedics rushed the surviving child to the hospital. Graves stayed behind, watching as forensic investigators combed through the wreckage of a broken family. The mother was found in the master bedroom, lying face down on the bed. A bottle of pills spilled beside her. The father was in the bathroom, a needle sticking out of his arm. Both had been dead for at least 3 days, and all that time, the surviving boy had been alone. Alone with the body of his little brother. The investigation revealed the full horror of what had happened. Mark had lost his job months ago. Depression, addiction, it had all spiraled out of control. The mother had tried to hold the family together, but eventually, she gave up too. She took too many pills, and never woke up. The father, too far gone, didn't even realize she was dead. He overdosed in the bathroom the next day, and at some point, whether from starvation, dehydration, or illness, the younger boy died too. His brother, too young to understand death, had done the only thing he could think of. He hid him under the mattress and waited for someone to come. The case haunted Graves. He couldn't stop thinking about the surviving boy, how long he had sat in that room, alone, waiting for help that never came, how he had still been sleeping next to his brother's body, too afraid to leave him behind. And worst of all, how, even at such a young age, he had learned something most people never do. That death doesn't wait for help to arrive. That sometimes, when the people who are supposed to protect you are gone, you're left to face the darkness alone. Officer Raymond Carter had been on the force long enough to see things most people couldn't stomach. Car accidents that left bodies twisted like broken dolls. Domestic disputes that ended in gunfire or silence, both equally chilling. He had witnessed death in more forms than he cared to count. But this case? This was something else entirely. It started as a disturbance call, a report of a man behaving erratically at a gas station on the edge of town. The caller said the man was talking to himself, pacing back and forth near the pumps. At first, it sounded like a routine call, maybe a drifter, maybe someone on something stronger than booze. But then the dispatcher's voice changed. Be advised, caller reports the suspect is mutilating himself. Carter froze in his patrol car, the words sinking in. What do you mean, mutilating? He asked, gripping the radio. There was a brief pause before the dispatcher replied. He's cutting off his own ear. Carter felt his stomach tighten. En route now. The gas station sat on the outskirts of town, a lonely island of neon in a sea of darkness. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a few cars and a single figure pacing near the pumps. Carter's headlights illuminated the man as he pulled in. He was shirtless, barefoot, his jeans smeared with something dark, blood. His left hand was clamped over the side of his head, and his right hand held a knife. A long, jagged hunting knife. Carter's gut told him to wait for backup, but then the man turned toward him, and Carter saw what was missing. Blood streamed down the man's neck, soaking into his bare shoulder. His left ear was gone, severed cleanly, as if he had sawed it off himself. The man's eyes were wild, unfocused, pupils blown so wide his irises were nearly invisible. His chest heaved with every breath, and the knife in his grip gleamed under the gas station lights. Carter drew his weapon, keeping his voice calm but firm. Put the knife down, buddy. The man staggered forward, his bare feet smacking wetly against the concrete. He was mumbling now, something low and feverish, but Carter couldn't make out the words. I need you to put the knife down, Carter repeated, stepping back slightly. You're hurt. Let's get you some help. The man blinked at him. Then he whispered, It was talking to me. Carter felt a chill crawl up his spine. What was talking to you? The man swayed, the knife dipping lower in his grip. His breath came out in shaky bursts, his body trembling as if he were trying to hold something back. My ear, he whispered. Carter tightened his grip on his gun. Your ear. The man nodded, his blood-slick fingers twitching against his cheek. It wouldn't shut up, he rasped. I told it to stop. I told it to stop. But it just kept whispering. So I cut it off. His chest hitched, and for a second, he looked almost relieved. Carter swallowed hard. This wasn't just drugs. This was something worse. The man raised the knife again. Carter's heart pounded. He kept his voice steady. Drop it. Now. The man tilted his head, as if listening to something only he could hear. Then, he smiled. A wide, unnatural grin, too big for his face. And Carter realized something. The man wasn't looking at him anymore. He was looking past him, like there was something standing right behind him. Carter fought every instinct not to turn around. Drop the knife. The man's smile widened. Then, he let the knife fall. The blade clattered against the pavement, and the man collapsed to his knees, gasping like he had just run a marathon. Carter wasted no time. He holstered his weapon and moved in, securing the man's wrists with cuffs. You're going to be all right, he said, though he wasn't sure if that was true. The man let out a wet, shaking laugh. Maybe. His head lolled to the side, eyes drifting shut as if he were finally at peace. And that's when Carter saw it. The man's severed ear, lying on the ground near the knife. And the worst part? The ear's lips were moving, like it was still whispering. The paramedics arrived minutes later. They cleaned the man up, sedated him, and whisked him away in the ambulance. Carter stayed behind, staring at the blood-stained pavement, trying to make sense of what he had seen. The knife, the ear, the smiling man who had looked past him like he saw something else there. The whole scene felt wrong. The gas station's security footage later showed something even stranger. The man had arrived an hour earlier, alone. At first, he had just stood near the pumps, staring into the darkness beyond the lot. He wasn't talking, wasn't moving, just standing there. Then, suddenly, he had grabbed his knife and started cutting. No hesitation, no flinching, as if something had told him to do it. In the last frame of the video, right before Carter arrived, the man looking up, his eyes going wide in terror. as if he had finally seen whatever had been whispering to him all along. Carter never forgot that night. The man lived. He was committed to a psychiatric ward, where he never spoke again. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, Carter would wake up in a cold sweat, his ears ringing with something too faint to hear, like a whisper, right inside his head. And every time, he had the same thought. What if he had turned around that night? What would he have seen? Officer Megan Calloway had been on the force for 9 years, long enough to see the worst of humanity. The overdoses, the bodies pulled from wreckage, the homes filled with misery. But nothing, compared to the house on Parker Street. The call had come in from a landlord, complaining that his tenant hadn't paid rent in months. He had gone to check on her that afternoon, knocking repeatedly, but there had been no response. When he tried to look through the window, all he saw was movement inside. Shadows flickering in the dim light, shapes shifting in ways that didn't make sense. At first, he thought she had squatters. Then he caught a glimpse of something that made his stomach turn. A bony hand, barely moving. That's when he called 911. Calloway pulled up to the house just before sundown. It was an old, sagging structure, its white paint peeling like dead skin. The windows were coated in grime, the yard overgrown with weeds. The whole place smelled of neglect, like something left to rot in the sun. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. But through the silence, she swore she heard something inside. A faint scratching, like claws against wood. Calloway tried the doorknob. Unlocked. She stepped inside. The smell hit her immediately. It was thick, rancid, and wrong. A mix of unwashed clothes, rotting food, and something far worse. Her boots stuck slightly to the linoleum as she moved deeper into the house, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The living room was a disaster. Piles of dirty clothes, stacks of old newspapers, plates of food that had long since turned to mold and decay. But there was something else too. A noise. A low, hungry sound. She turned toward the bedroom door. It was open just an inch. Something moved behind it, and then she heard it. A soft meow. Calloway exhaled. Just a cat. Maybe the woman had passed away weeks ago, and the animal was just trapped inside. That's what she told herself as she pushed the door open. But then she saw the bed, and the thing lying on it. And suddenly, she wasn't so sure anymore. The woman was still alive. Barely. Her body was withered, skeletal. Her skin stretched too tight over her bones. Her cheeks were sunken, her lips cracked and dry as parchment. She was lying in the bed, motionless, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. Her eyes were open, but they didn't look at Calloway. They stared at the ceiling, unfocused, as if she wasn't fully there anymore. Calloway stepped closer. "Ma'am." No response. And then, she saw the blood. It was smeared across the woman's sheets, dried into dark, rust-colored stains. Her arms were covered in bite marks, small, deep wounds where chunks of flesh had been torn away. Her fingers twitched slightly, but she didn't react to the pain, didn't even seem to feel it. And then Calloway heard the meow again. She turned, and there, perched on the edge of the bed, was a cat. It was small, orange, its fur matted and dirty. Its mouth was red with blood. Calloway's stomach twisted. The cat licked its lips, and the woman just lay there, letting it happen. Calloway grabbed her radio with a shaking hand. "This is Officer Calloway. I need an ambulance at my location immediately. Subject is alive, but severely malnourished. Possible neglect or abuse." A crackle of static. "Copy that. Ambulance en route." She turned back to the woman, swallowing hard. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" The woman's lips parted slightly. Then, in a voice so small and fragile, she whispered, "It won't let me go." The paramedics arrived 10 minutes later. They moved the woman carefully, securing her to a stretcher. Calloway watched as they checked her vitals, their faces grim. One of them murmured something about severe dehydration. Another mentioned organ failure. She should have been dead already, but she wasn't. Not yet. Later, after the woman was transported to the hospital, Calloway spoke with the landlord. He told her the woman's name was Margaret Holloway. She had lived alone for years, barely leaving the house. After her husband died, she became a recluse, cutting ties with her family, ignoring phone calls, avoiding people. But here's the thing. The landlord swore she didn't own a cat. Not when she first moved in. Not ever. The hospital staff tried to save her. They hooked her up to machines, pumped her full of fluids. But Margaret never spoke again. She just lay there, staring at the ceiling. She died 3 days later. Calloway never forgot that house. But the part that stuck with her the most? The cat was never found. Animal control set traps. Searched the entire neighborhood. But it was just gone. Like it had never been there at all. Weeks later, Calloway woke up in the middle of the night. A strange sound echoed through her apartment. A soft, scratching noise. Like claws against wood. Her chest tightened. She reached for her bedside lamp, flipping it on. Her room was empty. But on the foot of her bed, there was a single, small paw print, pressed into the blanket, still wet, like something had been there, watching, waiting. Officer Patrick Willis had been on the force long enough to know that some people don't belong in the world. Some people are broken in ways that can't be fixed, that no amount of therapy or prison time can repair. That's why, when he heard the name Daniel Whitaker come over the radio, his stomach dropped. Daniel Whitaker had been in a mental hospital for years. He had been locked away after a violent psychotic episode, one that left 2 people dead. He wasn't just sick, he was dangerous. And now, somehow, he was out, and his wife was dead. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio, the urgency clear. All units, we have a confirmed homicide at 125 Larkspur Lane. Possible suspect Daniel Whitaker. Approach with caution. Willis had arrested Whitaker once before. Years ago, during a domestic dispute. Back then, he was just another angry man. Just another guy who thought he could control his wife through fear. But the second time was worse. 5 years ago, police found 2 people butchered in a basement. A neighbor called 911, reporting screams. When officers arrived, Whitaker was sitting on the front porch, drenched in someone else's blood. He was calm, too calm. The bodies inside were unrecognizable. The damage wasn't just rage, it was something else entirely. And when they cuffed him, when they put him in the back of the squad car, all he said was, "She told me to do it." They locked him away in a state hospital after that. And that should have been the end of it. But somehow, someone let him out. And now, his wife was dead. When Willis arrived at the house on Larkspur Lane, the first thing he noticed was how quiet it was. No sirens. No neighbors watching from their porches. Just stillness. The front door was wide open. The house was dark. And the only sound was the faint creaking of a ceiling fan inside. His hand tightened around his gun as he stepped onto the porch. "Police," he called out. "Daniel Whitaker, if you're inside, come out with your hands up." Silence. Then, a voice. Low, rasping. "She's still here." Willis's blood ran cold. The voice had come from inside the house. From the darkness beyond the door. He raised his weapon and stepped inside. His boots sinking into something wet. He didn't have to look down to know what it was. The smell hit him instantly. Blood, thick and metallic, clinging to the air like a fog. And then, in the dim light of the living room, he saw her. Whitaker's wife. Or what was left of her. She was propped up in a chair, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her throat was cut clean across, but her face was untouched. Her eyes were open, wide, and staring, as if she had seen something unimaginable in her final moments. Willis swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay focused. "Daniel." His voice was steady. "Come out. Now." The house was silent. Then, a creak. From the hallway. Willis turned, gun aimed toward the sound. The hallway was dark, the door at the end barely open. He moved forward slowly, his pulse pounding. The door squeaked as he nudged it open with his foot. The room was empty, except for Daniel Whitaker, standing in the corner, facing the wall, muttering. Willis kept his gun raised. "Daniel." The muttering stopped. For a long moment, Whitaker didn't move. Then, slowly, he turned his head, just enough to glance over his shoulder. His eyes were wide, unfocused, and he was smiling. Willis felt his grip tighten. "Put your hands where I can see them." Whitaker's lips moved, but the words, they didn't make sense. "She's still here. She told me to do it. She's still watching." Willis's chest tightened. "There's no one here but you and me, Daniel." Whitaker's smile widened, and then he looked past Willis, as if someone was standing right behind him. Willis ignored the chill crawling up his spine. "Get on the ground," he ordered. Whitaker laughed softly, but he did as he was told. Sank to his knees, didn't resist, just kept smiling, and the whole time, he kept staring at something over Willis's shoulder. They took Whitaker into custody without a fight, but when they got him in the squad car, he leaned in close to Willis, close enough that his breath touched Willis's ear, and he whispered, "You don't see her yet, but you will." Then he started laughing, and didn't stop. Whitaker was sent back to the hospital that same night, locked up again, for good this time, or so they said. But Willis never forgot what he saw in that house. The way Whitaker's wife had been left sitting there, her eyes wide with terror, as if she had seen something worse than death. The way Whitaker had smiled, like he was sharing a joke only he understood. And the way he had looked at nothing, nothing that Willis could see. For weeks after, Willis felt uneasy, like something was just out of sight, like there was a presence in the corners of empty rooms. Then, one night, he was reviewing footage from his body cam, and that's when he saw it. The moment in the hallway, right before Whitaker turned around. For just a split second, the footage glitched, and in the darkness behind Willis, there was a shadow, tall, watching, gone in a blink. Willis doesn't talk about Whitaker anymore, but sometimes, in quiet moments, when the station is empty and the halls are dark, he feels something, like someone is watching, and every time he turns his head, there's nothing there, yet somehow, he knows she's still here. It started with a knock, just one, sharp and deliberate. Officer Greg Larson had spent the weekend at his parents' farmhouse, a quiet break from the city. They lived deep in the countryside, miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by endless fields and thick woods. The kind of place where nothing ever happened. At least, that's what he thought. Because that night, something knocked on the window, and when he looked outside, there was nothing there. Larson had been sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee with his father, when they heard it. A single, loud knock against the front window. His dad frowned. "Did you hear that?" Larson set his mug down, already standing. "Yeah." A second knock. This time, on the side window. His father turned toward the sound, his expression darkening. "It's past midnight. Who the hell would be out here at this hour?" Larson moved to the front door, flicking on the porch light. The bulb buzzed, casting a dull glow over the empty yard. Beyond the light's reach, the fields stretched into darkness, their tall stalks swaying in the wind. Nothing. No car. No movement. Just the silence of the countryside. Another knock. But this time, it came from the back of the house. Larson turned fast, his heartbeat picking up. He moved quickly through the kitchen, toward the back door. His father followed close behind, his steps slow and cautious. When Larson reached the back door, he hesitated. The hair on his arms was standing up. Something about this felt wrong. He took a breath, steadied himself, and threw open the door. The cold night air rushed in, the porch light flickered, and nobody was there. Just the empty fields and the tree line beyond them. But something wasn't right. The air felt too still, like the whole world was holding its breath. Larson stepped outside, his boots crunching against the gravel. He shined his flashlight across the backyard, sweeping it over the barn, the trees, the rusting old tractor near the fence line. Nothing. Then his father muttered, "Look at the ground." Larson turned his light downward, and his stomach dropped. There were no footprints. The ground was soft from recent rain. Anyone walking up to the house would have left tracks. But there was nothing. No signs of anyone or anything having been there. And yet, they had heard the knocking. They went back inside, locking the doors behind them. Larson checked every room, every window. Nothing was out of place. His father sat at the table, staring at the front door, his jaw clenched. "This has happened before," he said quietly. Larson turned to him. "What?" His father didn't look away from the door. "The knocking. I've heard it before." Larson felt a chill run down his spine. "How often?" His father exhaled slowly. "Every few months. Only at night. Always after midnight." Larson stared at him. "You never told me." His father's eyes were dark. "Because it doesn't make sense." That night, Larson slept lightly, his gun on the nightstand. At 3:12 a.m., he woke up because something was tapping on his window. Slow, rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. His breath caught in his throat. He turned his head toward the window and saw a shape, tall, thin, standing just beyond the glass. Larson grabbed his gun and jumped out of bed. By the time he reached the window, the figure was gone. But there were no footsteps outside, just the whispering wind and the endless dark fields. The next morning, Larson asked around town. A few of the older locals got quiet when he mentioned it. Then one of them, an old man named Ellis, finally spoke. "You heard the knocking, didn't you?" Larson frowned. "What do you know about it?" Ellis looked toward the horizon, as if watching for something. "Been happening for years. Always the farmhouses. Never in town." Larson's skin prickled. "Who is it?" Ellis shook his head. "Not who. What?" Larson waited. Then Ellis said, "My grandfather told me about it. Said it's been around longer than any of us. Some folks think it's a person. Others, they don't think it's human at all." Larson felt his mouth go dry. "And what happens if you open the door?" Ellis turned to him, his expression unreadable. "No one knows." Larson stared at him. "What do you mean?" Ellis exhaled. "I mean, the ones who opened the door?" A long pause. "They were never seen again." Larson never heard the knocking again. Not for years. Not until one night, long after his father had passed, when he stayed in the farmhouse again. At 3:12 a.m., he woke up. And this time, the knocking was right outside his bedroom door. Slow. Tap, tap, tap. He reached for his gun, held his breath, and didn't move. Not until the sun came up. Not until the knocking stopped. And even then, he never opened the door. Because now he knew. Some doors should never be opened.